Good afternoon and welcome to coffee. Oh, wait, I gotta get the coffee. I forget it. Good afternoon and welcome to the first ever Coffee with Mike. This is all going to be filmed at my home because we're all quarantined. But no matter how bad this first Coffee with Mike is, I know you'll watch it because you have nothing else to do for the next 2 months except to talk to your wife, talk to your husband, pet the dog, or watch a rerun of the 2012 British Open golf tournament. So on top of that, I'm 64 years old. And I still live in my parents' house, and I'm telling you this for a reason, on a wonderful little street where I played all kinds of sports with my childhood friends, Mark and Richard and Tom and a bunch of other guys, and we didn't play with girls in the early 60s. You just didn't do it. So let's begin by showing you this wonderful scroll from my parents' private collection by Shabbat Zeshin. It's been on loan to the Cleveland Art Museum. And I'm going to walk over here and show you this. You have to be really brilliant to be in the Japanese art world to know the titles and everything. This is called Woman in a Round Window, Snow Falling. And it was done in 1860s, 1870s. The reason I tell you about Shabbat Zeshin, and I'm going to go back over to the couch and I'm going to have a little coffee. I'm glad I remembered the coffee. The reason I tell you about Shabbat Zeshin is that he lived a very humble life, and my parents lived a very humble life. Even though my dad was a doctor, they lived in a very, very small house. And it says in the information about Shabbat Zeshin that he lived in a small house owned by his parents, just like me. But when I was a little kid, I used to play baseball in the living room with my friends, and we would put our mitts on. This is my son Kevin's mitt. Both my kids played baseball through college, but Kevin gave me his old mitt from high school. And we would pretend that we were one of the Cleveland Indians, who absolutely sucked back when we were kids, but we still loved them. But I'll show you a little bit. If you could move over to the right a little bit, that's your right. And I'll show you a little bit what we did. We usually did it on the floor, but since I'm sitting on the couch, I would throw these baseballs up right near the Zeshin scroll, and I'd catch the ball. I know you're not supposed to do that, and so why do I bring this up? I bring this up because I think collecting art should be as much fun as playing with your friends, no matter what you like to do. And the other reason I bring it up is I just watched a wonderful video by my colleague, Elias Martin, of collecting Japanese prints. And this was on collecting Japanese prints. And Elias, he gave a very serious video on how to care and conserve your Japanese prints and paintings. And I was so impressed with his video, and that he was doing this to bring his collectors right into his living room, that I decided to try it, but in my own way. At any rate, if you want to learn more serious aspects of Japanese prints, you should watch Elias's program every Wednesday. And Elias, I know you wouldn't approve of me throwing a baseball up against a wall next to a Shabbat Zeshin scroll, but it's just me. Coffees with Mike will be more relaxed and hopefully humorous look at the world of Japanese prints based on my family's 67 years of experience. Whether I'm right about many of these artists will be determined in about 100 years. However, if I'm wrong, many great museums are wrong too. For those of you who don't know me from coaching Little League baseball, sitting at a bar, or laughing at dumb jokes, my parents lived in Kamakura, Japan in 1953 and 1954. My dad was a doctor in the U.S. Navy. And they had they didn't have much money, but they had a love of the Japanese culture and the art of Japan. The private collection has been on loan to the Metropolitan Museum in New York. It's been on loan to the Cleveland Museum, and it's been on loan to the Fogg at Harvard and several other museums. The one thing that my parents taught me, and the one reason I have a very, very good eye, and it's not something you can learn in a textbook on Japanese art or Japanese prints. The one thing they taught me is to always select art with your eyes and your heart. And you'll get something you really enjoy, whether it's inexpensive or expensive. The first scroll paintings my parents ever collected were $15 each back in 1953. Those were the ones on loan to the Metropolitan Museum in New York. A lot of what I'm doing, because I'm dealing with contemporary Japanese prints, there's no history behind all in terms of prices and everything, and in terms of importance. I have to use my eye and my heart to select what I think are the best works that are being made now. My parents said to never follow trends or hype in the art world. So from here, I'm going to take you to the porch and begin by showing you briefly 5 works that I really like at the gallery. For this first Coffee with Mike, I'm going to show you mainly traditional images of Japan done by antique and contemporary Japanese printmakers and contemporary Western printmakers and painters who are living in Japan. Each week I'll show you another group of prints, and some of them are going to be expensive, some of them are going to be inexpensive. But remember, when you look at these, you can say, Michael, you're right, Michael, you're wrong. Follow your heart and use your eyes. So I'm not going to bring the coffee in there because I know Elias wouldn't want me to put coffee next to these prints. So let's go to the porch. Follow me. So this is the dining room. My family would all sit in here and nobody would talk to each other at dinner, but this is where we had dinner. So let's begin with this first print. This is called Buttercups. Buttercups was done in 1983. This work is in the British Museum and the Metropolitan Museum. I've only had it twice in the last 20 years. And it's by a guy named Daniel Kelly. Daniel Kelly was born in Idaho Falls, Idaho, and grew up in Great Falls, Montana. And he goes to Japan over 40 years ago. And a few days before he leaves from San Francisco, he has $1.95 in his pocket. And he can't afford the really expensive books on Japanese art. So he buys a small book by a Japanese printmaker named Tokariki. In the back of the book, it says, if the reader of this book is in Kyoto, please visit the artist's studio. So Daniel said, what the heck? He says, I'm going to go visit this guy. He became his pupil, and now his work's in the Metropolitan Museum, the Museum of Modern Art, the British Museum, the Smithsonian, and about 20 other museum collections. Now, one thing I didn't tell you is that this was on this porch. This was the porch table, and we used to eat corn on the cob here, and lots of butter and lots of big messes here. And I know this isn't clean enough for Elias, but and I think Elias said don't get much sunlight on these prints. Oh boy. Okay, so that takes us to a very famous print called Sailing Boats Mist by Hiroshi Yoshida. And this was done in 1926. And he did the sailing boats at different times of the day and night, like Monet did the haystacks. And Hiroshi Yoshida was known for the watercolor-like quality that he got in his woodblock prints. He was one of the top 2 landscape printmakers from 1910s to the 1950s. The other artist who was really important was Hasui. And this is a print called Snow at Daiichi. It was done in 1925, and it was published by Issei Tatsu. Most of the prints by Hasui were published by Watanabe. And the key with Hiroshi Yoshida and Hasui is that you have to make sure that the right seals are in the border, otherwise it's not a first edition. That takes us to a printmaker named Katsunori Hamanishi. This is called Prime Fall. Katsunori Hamanishi has had exhibitions at the Art Institute of Chicago, the Smithsonian, and his triptych of the Four Seasons from his Kimono series was featured at the Metropolitan Museum of Art collection. His work is in numerous major museum collections. He's probably the most important Mezzotint artist in the world. And that takes us to a woman named Sarah Breyer. And Sarah Breyer was born in Rochester, New York. And she has lived in Japan for over 40 years. Her work's in the British Museum and the Smithsonian, to name a few. She works in an 800-year-old papermaking village called Echizen with a living national treasure. She's the first Western woman ever to get the cover of the top contemporary Japanese print show in Tokyo. But I'm going to show you an early work by her. This early work is called His Story. The reason I picked out his story is it reminds me of walking around the block with my dad and the family dog. I would walk around the block with my dad, and he would tell me these humorous stories and encourage me to use my imagination, and that anything was possible. You know, when I started doing this about 40 years ago, I've been running the gallery for about 40 years. Everybody said it was impossible to have a major Japanese print gallery in Cleveland, Ohio. And because of these walks I had with my dad, I think he made me realize that anything was possible and that you could be very successful, but never hurt anybody to get to be successful. So the final piece I selected is by a guy named Joel Stewart, who was born in Danville, California. It's called Wildflower. Joel Stewart has lived in Japan for over 30 years. His work's in many different museums. He's a printmaker and painter. This happens to be a painting by him that he recently completed of this tea bowl. And the reason I identify with Joel is that about 25 years ago, he and Daniel Kelly used to smoke cigarettes, and they probably wasn't cigarettes. And they would light their cigarettes either with a blowtorch or a candle. And they forgot to put the candle out about 25 years ago, and they went to the train station, and the candle falls into his disposal, which was made out of plastic, and he burns his whole studio down. But ever since he did that, he turned into a really great artist. And if you look back in the history of all the top printmakers from about 1850 on, all the top publishers of Japanese prints, and all the top Japanese print galleries, everybody that burns their place down becomes really famous. So when this happened, I said, that's fantastic, Joel. I had no idea that I would be doing this one day, but when I was 9 years old, I burned part of my parents' house down playing with matches, and that's a whole nother story. Let me tell you about Wildflowers. This is what Joel says. He says, I selected the title Wildflowers because it talks about what drew me to the subject in the first place. A rendering of some humble-looking flower that one walks by every day without noticing. I love the admiration for the humble guy in Japanese culture. Even the skilled craftsman who originally painted the original flower on the original tea bowl was probably a modest guy too, just doing his thing every day, but putting his heart into it nonetheless. And that's what the Verne Gallery is all about. When I first started doing shows in New York and Los Angeles and San Francisco and Washington, people walked by me. They didn't notice me. But 40 years later, by being humble and modest and quiet, I think the the Vernon Collection has played a special role in the world of contemporary Japanese prints and originally old Japanese prints and paintings. At the end of each video, I will crumple up a script and try to throw it into the wastebasket. I did this with my friends when I was little, and we do this for hours. I'm going to take one more break here, and I'm going to go get the wastebasket, which I forgot. We'll see if I can get it into the wastebasket. What I would do is I would sit on a chair like this, and my friends and I, on a boring day, sort of like what we're all experiencing right now with the quarantine, I would crumple up the paper. I would aim, and I'd shoot the basket. And if you've learned nothing else from Coffee with Mike, I would suggest that for the next 2 months, crumple up some paper and take your wastebasket out and shoot. And I hope you've enjoyed Coffee with Mike. Thank you for listening, and have a good afternoon.